Hey, this is Morgan Page. We're in the studio here, just showing you a little behind the scenes. This is basically a blank canvas, how I start every song. Every song starts with a draft, and with this last album and also with this upcoming album, what I do is basically draft a day. It usually takes about a day and a half. I'll open up a template like this. Doesn't really predetermine the kind of song. I mean, it starts out at 128 BPM, but I can move that around. I found that's just a good utility kind of tempo. It seems to work well, and I can always shift it later, even though you lose a little bit of quality. But most stuff I do is around 128. And basically, in this session, so where I start, everything's grouped out. I have plugins that are inactive, but I have them set in the template, which saves time. And I have the plugins set to just certain starting points. So the vocal EQs might have a filter set on them to take out some of the lows. There's probably already a sidechain compressor on there for the pads or for the bass line. And it changes. I try to update this template every couple weeks or every month or so. But it starts out with Stylus. Chop up a beat in Stylus, and then start slicing things, pairing them together, layering drums, building up a pretty complete beat. Some days you may take a few hours just to build a kick drum. Some days maybe just use a sample. And I'll gradually build it track by track. These days I'm trying to keep it simpler, using less loops. I think pitfall a lot of producers fall into early on is using way too many loops. And the problem with that is that you have things phasing out with each other, too many hi-hats, too many layers competing for that frequency space. Oh, you can hear a ghetto bird flying over the studio. This is Los Angeles. So, I build these tracks up, try to use every track effectively. Every track should be adding something and moving it along. So, to use really simple sounds that don't have a lot of harmonics works well. One thing I like in Logic is that Klopfgeist plugin that has that very sort of metronome kind of sound, but you can use it for bass lines, you can use it as a clave sort of percussive element. So I like working with these simple sounds where when I'm changing the parameters, I know exactly what's going to happen to them. If it's a really complex timbre to the sound, subtle changes, it's hard to hear what's happening, what you're affecting in the track. So good simple sounds take up less space in the mix, and they're really fun to work with. So these days I'm trying to layer stuff a little less with the snares and things, and really only layer where it makes sense. Also down here you can see sort of have filters set on the plugins. I got auto tune on the vocals. Only problem in Pro Tools is it adds in a bunch of delay, so you have to nudge things around, which is a pain in the ass. These tracks are all going out to a summing mixer, but to keep things simple, I'll just route them to a bus. The vocals are on one bus, the guitars are on one bus. That way we can compress them just subtly to even them out in the mix. I always like to have a little bit of white noise and pink noise in the mix, and I'll be shaping that with automation. Usually have certain key elements in a track. So I got the drum layers, I got some organic layers to push it along beyond just sort of the syncopated drums, things like shakers, anything from the sound of sizzling bacon or other sort of noise sounds to add that little bit of air to it. Use those sometimes. A lot of times we'll actually sing a guide vocal in there just to get the melody that's in my head down onto into a waveform immediately before I forget it. Add in a temporary bass line. Most of these drafts, it's a beat, a chord progression, an arpeggio, a lead, maybe some supporting pads as a layer, and maybe a few sweeps, but I try not to spend too much time getting into the window dressing of the track. The stuff's just getting triggered off MIDI. I'm definitely a big fan of outboard keyboards, or analog keyboards and outboard gear, but it's always nice with these instruments, soft synths, since you can get that sound and really automate it, and you're not stuck with the sound, but sometimes that limitation is really nice. Down here, let's see, I've got the piano. It comes with Pro Tools 8. It's just good for drafting things up quickly. It's got a pretty good sound. using this plugin a lot, the SSL channel. I always have the Echo Boy as sort of my go-to delay. I start with a short delay and a long delay. And I've got an external reverb, a hardware reverb, and everything goes to these Avalon U5s. And I just sort of, to save time, I have these things pre-configured to go to certain buses, so these are going to delays and other things. Also, this is sort of a setup for summing, but usually I would do it more of a simple way and just have sort of instrument buses, but for this, it's sending out pairs to a D-Box summing mixer, which is giving it a little extra punch. It's got a little more headroom to play with. And at the end of the signal chain here, I usually just compress it a little bit because I don't want to drastically affect the sound. So SSL makes these great bus compressors, or it's the Waves SSL. PSP Vintage Warmer is really nice. So I'll use either the SSL or the PSP, and then sort of processing it pretty heavily through Ozone at the end. And it's got pretty much everything you need in there. Limiter, harmonic exciter, multiband compressor, stereo imager. I don't really use the multiband compressor much at all. I just think it has a kind of colored sound to it. Not particularly the one in Ozone, but just in general. So I kind of steer clear of that. I like to just use the buses by themselves. Also really liking this plugin Isotope Alloy, which is really nice. So I'm going to open that up. This is a brand new one that Isotope makes. It's got a really nice equalizer. It's kind of like a lighter version of Ozone. Really flexible EQ, harmonic excitement. You can do in multiband. You can widen things harmonically. You can change the transients around, kind of like those SPL plugins and hardware units. And it's got a good compressor. You can sidechain, de-esser, and a really good limiter. And there's no delay on this, so that's really good for Pro Tools. So that's definitely one of my favorites right now. That's pretty much it. That's sort of the template in a nutshell. And that's how I go about making my drafts.